Serial killers have occurred through the centuries, basically since the dawn of human existence. The depraved monsters who lurk among us inspire both absolute dread and irresistible curiosity. We simply can't believe the twisted acts of horror they commit, their warped views of right and wrong, their inability to feel remorse for the lives they've taken and the families they've destroyed, and their seemingly senseless thirst for blood. It's the last of these traits, however, that is possessed by a rather unusual yet terrifying subset of serial killers, those who engage in cannibalism. These murderers consume the flesh and blood of the victims they kill for various reasons, ranging from a sense of keeping their victims forever to more demented spiritual beliefs. Whatever the reason is, we can be sure it's deeply demented and decidedly disturbed. Real quick, before we jump into the video, if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Any positive feedback you leave, whether it's comments, likes, or shares, helps a lot to please the YouTube algorithm and get these videos in front of more eyes and grow the channel. Now, let's get into it. Ottis Toole was a serial killer who operated for an undetermined length of time from the 1960s to the 1980s, and who was also a brief companion to and partner in crime of the more infamous serial killer Henry Lee Lucas. The two stalked and terrorized Florida, leading to Toole being dubbed the Jacksonville Cannibal. Though Ottis told many wild tales of homicide which made it difficult to determine which murders were authentic and which were not, it's believed that he committed his first murder at the age of 14. He claims to have killed over 100 people. Toole was raised in a turbulent, abusive household, making later claims of incest and rape by a neighbor and his sister. The most intriguing part of Toole's childhood stemmed from his grandmother, who he claimed was a Satanist. Apparently, Toole's grandmother gave him the moniker the Devil's Child, as she showed him allegedly satanic practices such as grave robbing and self-mutilation. He would later drop hints of satanic inspiration for his killings, confessing to at least 108 total murders. Toole had a very low IQ and needed the aid of Lucas to continue undetected. During their time together, it was stated by Lucas that Toole would take his victims and cook them as a barbecue, with Lucas later recounting that, quote, he wasn't a cannibal because he didn't like the taste of Toole's barbecue sauce. The two deranged killers had a combined confession of hundreds of victims. It was said that throughout Toole's killing spree, he liked to eat the ribs of his victims and drink their blood, something Lucas seemingly disapproved of later. When asked in an interview whether he actually ate people or not, Toole replied, "You look damn tasty. If I had me a knife, I'd slit your throat and drink some blood." The question is, how does one reach this level of depravity to cause such carnage? Toole and Lucas told much about their murders, yet were still left wanting something more concrete as to what drives a person to this level of evil. Toole's reasons for cannibalizing his victims, though seemingly impossible for the rest of us to follow, seem to simply boil down to nothing more than because I could. And he even once said he sometimes ate his victims simply to save money on groceries. That is the very definition of in cold blood. Audio recordings of the two madmen discussing their cannibalistic ways over the phone are plentiful and can be found online. If you're a die-hard metal fan, you may remember the time that the band Cannibal Corpse sampled serial killer Arthur Shawcross as the opening to one of their tracks, the title of which I'm not going to repeat here as I'm pretty sure it would get me demonetized. The audio clip of the madman speaking about his crimes seemed to suit the track perfectly. As Shawcross says, and I'm paraphrasing here to avoid the demonetization button, "I just took that knife and I cut her from neck down to her nethers." and then I cut it out and ate it. Such disturbing statements could only come out of a horror movie, right? Wrong. Arthur Shawcross, aka the Genesee River Killer, was a deranged murderer who took the lives of 14 people between 1972 and 1989. He began his murderous spree by killing 2 children in New York State. In 1990, he would be convicted of killing 10 sex workers. Shawcross mutilated each body senselessly and immensely. He claimed to have first cannibalized during the Vietnam War, saying it bred an unstoppable lust for killing and cannibalism within him. As is common with extremely brutal killers, many think these men exaggerate their claims of murder and cannibalism. But the candid nature with which Shawcross and others have delivered their testimony of bloodshed makes us wonder if it's they who exaggerate or us who just can't face the horrors of reality. Many interviews exist of Shawcross, who was very open about his murders throughout his life. These recordings show a laughing, often seemingly loving and jolly man casually discussing some of the most vile crimes the world has ever known. Make no mistake, Shawcross was a ruthless murderer and a bloodthirsty cannibal. Arthur Shawcross was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in 2008. Andrei Chikatilo, the infamous Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer whose brutal killing spree began with the murder of 9-year-old Lena Zakatnova in 1978 and turned into a reign of terror that would last over a decade. His story ended with the biggest spectacle in post-Soviet Russia, the capture and trial of a monster who had stalked several countries in the former USSR for decades, hunting along the train stations for fresh meat he could lure into the woods and kill. Chikatilo was an unusual serial killer, driven by a boiling rage within him from his lifelong inability to perform sexual acts. More often than not, he couldn't even have intercourse with his wife. It was from this that Chikatilo learned how to express his lust and sexual appetite through torture and sexual violence. Even during his trial and confession to murdering 56 people, Chikatilo came uncannily close to admitting to having engaged in cannibalism, but would ultimately back down when the time came to actually confess to eating people. Chikatilo met 17-year-old Larissa Kachenko outside a public library in 1981. He overpowered Kachenko and wrestled her to the ground, strangling her to death before biting off one of her nipples and desecrating her corpse. Chikatilo would disembowel many of his victims, often removing the uterus from women, which he said he would nibble and chew on, claiming to have enjoyed the taste and texture. He even bit off one victim's tongue. Chikatilo was executed on February 16, 1994. Also known as the Granny Ripper, Tamara Samsonova was a Russian-born serial murderer who you'd never suspect would be a brutal cannibal. At 68 years old, she was arrested in 2015 for the suspected murder of her 79-year-old friend Valentina Ulanova, after a closed-circuit camera captured what appeared to be her transporting body parts in a black plastic bag. Shortly after the video was recorded, local police discovered Ulanova's corpse. It had been left in a river after being decapitated. Investigation would later reveal that she killed at the very least 11 people, with an extreme likelihood of having murdered more. Following in the footsteps of Andrei Chikatilo, she seemed to have modeled her killing career after his acts of atrocity, including murder, dismemberment, and of course, cannibalism. Not only did she murder her longtime friend, Ulanova, but her husband and several other people close to her have all mysteriously disappeared over a 20-year period. 12 years before the Ilanova murder, a headless, limbless body was found in her street. That man's business card was later discovered in her flat. It is alleged that she even dismembered one of her victims while he was still alive. Her diaries tell of her murder spree, describing up to 11 murders in great detail. Ultimately, Samsonova was declared legally insane and suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. She was committed to a mental hospital by the court for her crimes. Robert Maudsley is an English serial killer who has spent over 25 years in an isolation cell. His cell freakishly resembles a scene out of Silence of the Lambs. Maudsley refers to it as a glass cage or a concrete coffin, and he's been dubbed the real-life Hannibal Lecter. It should also be noted here that while he is no hero, it's alleged that Maudsley made it a point to kill only sexual criminals specifically, which makes many wonder if the treatment he's received is actually justice. After being picked up by a man who allegedly showed him the pictures of the abuse he'd done to previous child victims, Maudsley strangled this man, later earning him the nickname Blue, in reference to the color of the victim's face as Maudsley strangled him to death. While incarcerated, Maudsley earned the moniker Hannibal the Cannibal by killing 2 inmates and allegedly eating one man's brain with a spoon that had been fashioned into a prison shank. It should be noted, however, that there is no actual proof that Maudsley indeed did eat the man's brain, so his status as a cannibal killer is still unconfirmed. Robert Maudsley has spent years in solitary confinement, completely isolated from the rest of the world, and has been dubbed Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Probably the most infamous of all cannibal serial killers and one of the most infamous murderers of all time is Jeffery Dahmer. Now, I generally try to avoid these really infamous, well-known serial killers in my videos because, well, they're just overdone. But for this list, we can't leave him out. He's become a household name, one that is almost synonymous with the phrase serial killer. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer would claim the lives of 17 young men and boys, usually drugging and strangling them before committing unsavory acts with their corpses, dismembering them, and sometimes eating them. His first 2 murders were separated by nearly a decade before he launched into a ravenous, alcohol-fueled spree of compulsive murder, luring innocent men and boys back to his apartment in Wisconsin. When police entered Dahmer's home, his apartment was a spectacle of dismembered body parts, skeleton furniture, photographs of nude, deceased men, body parts in the refrigerator, and a now iconic massive blue barrel which he had filled with hydrochloric acid, which he would use to dissolve the remaining body parts of the men he dismembered. Dahmer would later recount that eating his victims made him feel as if he was keeping them forever, as if they were going to remain a part of him, stating, "I was branching out. That's when the cannibalism started. Eating the heart and the arm muscle. It was a way of making me feel that they were part of me. At first, it was just curiosity, and then it became compulsive." Upon a search of his apartment, police would find a severed head in the refrigerator and 3 more in the freezer. Dahmer would ultimately be given 16 life sentences and would be murdered in prison by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Another infamous cannibal serial killer is Albert Fish, who murdered 8-year-old Grace Budd and ate her body over a series of 9 days. In one of the most brazen acts of murder, Fish strolled right into the Budd residence seeking a victim. His initial target was Grace's older brother, Edward Budd, who was 18 at the time. But upon seeing Grace, Fish decided that she would be much more suitable for his depraved plan of homicide and cannibalism. After a brief time with the Budds, Fish was able to convince the family to allow him to take the helpless Grace with him to a supposed party for his nephew that he claimed he was to be attending that evening. The Budd parents let Grace walk right out of the front door, hand in hand with a cannibalistic murderer. Fish would later write to Grace Budd's mother, detailing his killing and eating of her daughter in one of the most disturbing letters ever penned in the history of mankind. A portion of the letter to Mrs. Budd read, "On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her." The rest of the letter is probably not suitable for YouTube guidelines, but if you'd like to give it a read, it's easily available online, and it's chilling. This lesser-known cannibal murderer has only killed 2 people. While not technically a serial killer, I believe he deserves a place in this list. Peter Bryan's crimes could terrify even the strongest among us. The Englishman wasn't just evil or malicious, he was clinically insane, suffering from schizophrenia. In 1993, Bryan killed a young shopkeeper, Nisha Sheth, by beating her to death with a hammer. After confessing to this, Bryan would be admitted to Broadmoor Hospital, where Robert Maudsley also stayed. After several years in psychiatric care, doctors decided that Bryan was capable of returning to the community under terms of extended supervision. It was during this period of release that Peter Bryan would kill, cook, and eat his friend Brian Cherry. The police were called during an altercation the two had gotten into, in which Bryan killed Cherry with a hammer. When officers caught Bryan, he was frying Cherry's brain in a pan, allegedly with butter, and eating it. Later telling police, "I ate his brain with butter. It was really nice." As always, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I publish true crime and serial killer related content regularly. Stay safe out there.